Slavery and October 7th. You would ask, what does one have to do with the other? Well, there are parallels. Both dealt with kidnapping. One dealt with kidnapping of Israelites from Nigeria. The other dealt with kidnapping Israelites from Israel. Both in some ways might have partaken in idolatry. We could see from the Nova Music Festival, there were grand idols elevated at the stadium. And we know that Israelites in general were exiled from the land for the celebration of idol gods. Through the lens of racism, we perceive things differently. And in fact, sometimes we deem things different when they are very similar. But the only difference is the lens of racism through which we perceive them. So today I'd like to explore that and see if I'm accurate in how I present racism as it influences history and our perception of history. Let's first look at the transatlantic slave trade. From the mid-1600s to about 1830, the United States trafficked enslaved Igbos to the states of Virginia and Maryland in order to profit from their labor on tobacco. This was from Wikipedia. In that similar Wikipedia article, it states that according to historical estimates, approximately 90% of Igbos and non-Igbos that were captured and sold in the transatlantic slave trade were actually kidnapped. When we look at the movie Roots, which is a historical fiction, a movie produced by Alex Haley, this is a historical fiction about his family, and as he traces his family all the way back to his captured relative. In that movie, like I said, which is based on actual research, it shows that his cousin or his ancestor with the name Kunti Kinte was kidnapped. And this is depicted in this way because there are many slaves who were kidnapped. Another illustration, an illustration from the past of the kidnapping, was Oluda Equiana. He was only 11 years old when he was kidnapped in 1756. He was born in an Igbo province in Nigeria. It was not Nigeria back then, but the territory from where he was kidnapped, the Igbo province, is now presently a part of Nigeria. He was kidnapped along with his sister while his parents were out working in the fields. He was sold to traders and held captive in West Africa for 7 months. He was then sold to British slavers and shipped to Barbados and Virginia. And that has been the fate of many Igbos, millions of Igbos and non-Igbos. They were simply kidnapped from their homeland and trafficked across the Atlantic to the Americas and sold as slaves. What does the Bible say about slaves? Reading from Exodus chapter 21, verses 2 through 6, it says, "If you buy a Hebrew servant, or in this case a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go out free and pay nothing. If he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife, she has borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be the master's, and he shall go out by himself. But if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door, or to the doorpost of his master, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever." In this system that I just described to you in Exodus chapter 21, verses 2 through 6, this is a very humane system of servitude. So much so there could be instances when somebody's given their freedom and they opt to remain in servitude forever. And even though this says it's relegated to Hebrew slaves, we know that there's also a system for foreign slaves. But just to look at the Hebrew slave, it was more like a system of indentured servitude in which the slave was provided for, sometimes when there was a debt or other means that brought them into a compromising position financially, they could hire themselves out. But it was not for an indefinite period of time. It was only for a period of time of 6 years maximum, and then the person was given their freedom. There's more details on how this slave should be treated if it's a girl, and what would happen if there's injury brought to the slave. But we won't go in that today. But let's go on now and look at foreign slaves. So you have Hebrew slaves and you have non-Hebrew slaves. So if you have a Hebrew slaves, they have to be treated more or less like an indentured servant and released after 6 years. A foreign slave, however, looking at Leviticus 25 verses 45 through 46, a foreign slave, however, can be kept permanently and passed down to the generations. But again, the Torah outlines how you are to treat this slave, even if the person is to be a slave in perpetuity. And the Torah itself says, reading Exodus 25 verse 45, moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you, and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property. So even so, you are buying them, and they become your property. You may take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession, and they shall be your permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with rigor. Leviticus 25 verse 44 also reads, but as for your male and female slaves who you may have from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. What is interesting with that is the Lord outlines two different standards. One standard for the nation of Israel and the people who are under the Bible, who are under Torah, and another standard for the nations who are not necessarily under the Bible and under Torah, but these are just the strangers that are dwelling among you. When we compare this to slavery in America, we see that slavery was perpetrated and espoused by many Christians in the church. And they justified the Bible, they justified slavery by using the Bible. Many people would say that slavery was the curse of the black man because the black men are the descendants of Ham. And so this is the curse of God upon Ham. But again, that is a fallacy because God never cursed Ham. In the incident with Noah, only Canaan and his descendants were cursed. And we could see that the curse on Canaan was brought to fruition when the Israelites went in and captured the nation that they dwelt in and expelled them from the land. But yet and still they will use scriptures and the Bible to say that God endorses the slavery that they perpetrated in this country. What's interesting is that many of the slaves they held in bondage were also Christians. They were fellow believers. So I want to ask the question, could the enduring state of slavery by the Christian church have been a violation of the Bible when compared to a Hebrew not being able to enslave another Hebrew indefinitely? Because a Christian is grafted into the olive tree, which is Israel. Paul tells you that in the book of Romans, chapter 11. So if we are a part of God's family, and then you have a slave that is also part of God's family, are you then limited in the rigor with which you can treat them and the duration with which you can enslave them? I will leave that for you to ponder as we look now at the Bible's position on kidnapping. Exodus 21:16 says, he who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hands, shall surely be put to death. The Torah specifically states that if you took a slave and you, by virtue of kidnapping and sell that slave, you are to be put to death. You see this again in Deuteronomy 24, verse 7, where it says, if a man is found kidnapping any of his brethren of the children of Israel and mistreats or sells him, then that kidnapper shall die, and you shall put away the evil from among you. And it's interesting that, as I've stated, a good portion of the slaves that were captured during the slave trade were Igbos, Israelites, and some of the sellers and perpetrators of slavery were Jews at the time. Did they know they were selling their brethren? Circumcision would have been an early indication that perhaps you're dealing with your brother. But that's another day's topic as well. So in fact, what we witness in history could be tantamount to a kidnapped people being trafficked and sold. And one may say, well, perhaps the people that they were being sold to in the New World did not know. Well, this again can be compared to the hostages that were captured on October 7th in Israel. Many of them were taken into Egypt and Qatar and other parts of the Muslim world. And who among the Muslim world could claim ignorance? None of them. And neither could anyone else during the times of the transatlantic slave trade say they were ignorant to how these captured Africans were being obtained and brought to the New World. They all knew, but they turned a blind eye because it profited them. And if the Bible condemned the perpetrator of the crime of kidnapping with the death penalty, what do you think the punishment should be for one who personally profited and partook in this ill-gotten gain of slavery? What many are so apt to call slavery, when viewed through the lenses of the Bible, this more closely resembles kidnapping more so than biblical slavery. But you see, racism, it blurs our lenses, so we don't always see people for who they are. And if this analogy to October 7th enrages you, ask yourself the question, why? Because slavery occurred a couple hundred years ago, and October 7th occurred a couple years ago? Well, then let's look at the Holocaust. 1940 to 1945. 6 million Jews were killed. And we are reminded of it daily through the media, through movies, through documentary. But are you aware that from 1967 to 1970, there was an African Holocaust where these same Igbos, Israelites, that were captured during the slave trade, that there was also a Holocaust by the Nigerian government and millions of them died? Are you aware that with the October 7th negotiations with Hamas to release hostages, that among them that were released in phase 1 was Avira Mengistu, that he was held captive by Hamas for over a decade, and very little was said of him being detained, and his family was pressured not to speak out? Is his life less than the others that were kidnapped on October 7th because of the pigmentation of his skin? Are the lives of the Igbos that died in the Biafran War less than the Jews that died in Europe in 1945? Is the crime of kidnapping the same to our God, whether it be October 7th or 1600 to 1830 with the transatlantic slave trade? Let us remove the lens of racism so that we can perceive history accurately for the betterment of all mankind. Shalom.